My name is Devin Hunter, and I'm assistant professor of history at University of Illinois Springfield. And I'm also serving this year as the Illinois State Historical Society Symposium Committee Chair. So it is my honor to welcome you to the keynote for this year. And I'll introduce our guest here in just a minute. I wanted to encourage you to visit the ISHS website, which I'll put a link in the chat here in a bit, to see the, first of all, see the remaining sessions for tomorrow at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock that you can join via webinar, and also links to some of the things that we pre-recorded and even some of the recorded sessions already up on the ISHS YouTube channel that you can check out. And also encourage you to take a look at all the other offerings that ISHS has, and encourage you to get involved in society or nonprofit independent organization, and greatly rely on your support, donations, and general viewership of programs like this. So I'll be sending some information along in the chat there. You do have an opportunity to ask questions and make comments, preferably through the Q&A button on your screen, but you can also put it in the chat, but it's a little easier for us to see Q&A. And we'll have time to hear from you, the audience. So I'll introduce our guest tonight, our keynote speaker. Santiago X is an indigenous futurist, a multidisciplinary artist and architect specializing in land, architectural, and new media installation. His work illuminates the liminal space between the ancestral plane and our accelerating post-human world. X is a 3A Arts Award winner, a 2020 New City Top 50 artist, an advisor on the inaugural Chicago Monuments and Memorials Committee, and the first Native American contributor to the Chicago Architecture Biennial. His work is exhibited and collected internationally, including at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art, Ars Electronica, and the MCA Chicago. In 2020, X was commissioned by the US State Department as lead artist of the American Arts Incubator Brazil, where he traveled to Brazil and conducted workshops culminating in a virtual reality exhibit entitled Portal. He received a Bachelor's of Environmental Design from the University of Colorado, a Master's of Architecture from the University of Southern California, and a Master's of Fine Arts Studio in Art and Technology from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's an enrolled citizen of the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana and the Indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guam. Currently, X is reinvigorating the ancestral mound building practice of his Coushatta people via 2 large-scale augmented public earthwork installations along the Chicago and Des Plaines rivers in Chicago, in what is now known as the 4000 North Project. This is notably the first time effigy earthworks have been constructed by indigenous peoples in North America since the founding of the United States. You can see an extensive portfolio of X's work in a shop where you can support his work on his website, santiagox.com. And before turning it over to X, I just wanted to read a little bit from his eloquent and provocative artist statement. Quote, "As an indigenous futurist, I believe that art can transcend representation and become something sacred that embodies life itself. I believe that through a multiplicity of creation and being, our knowledge can be embedded into the landscape, providing access for future generations of prosperity." Santiago Ox, thank you so much, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Devin, for that introduction. Hafa day, Chicano, everyone. First, I'd like to get started with an acknowledgement of sorts. It's a work that I created at the end of last year, kind of in the middle of the pandemic. But it's a love letter to the land, to the water, to the sky, to the ancestral people. It's the first iteration of an unfolding film series called Acknowledgement, and I'd like to go ahead and share that work with you right now.
Ju anin kinoa Anishinabedok Minoa Nindanue Makanidok Nungum Sagogina Wind Kidayayang Padawadamia King Geget Bichnago Nungum Minoa Kagike Ayayang Apne Padawadamia King Chicago Niswe Ishkude Sakaswe Iwidiwen Ojibwe Odawa Padawadami Kanakwe Skoda Dewang Chicago Minowa Bakang Kitche Odinong Yeget Bakan Nishnabeg Dashmayag Yem Nishnabeg Miami Ho-Chunk Menominee Peoria Gorje Yang Oma Miigwech
Timalaka Amayiksa Fitu. My name is X. I'm a citizen of the Cosati Nation of Louisiana and Indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guahan. Hello, my relatives. I come from the Turkey clan, given to me by my mother, by my grandmother, and great-grandmother. And both of my cultural societies, our arts, our clans, are passed down matrilineally, matriarchally. And that's the same story for the majority of indigenous cultures in North America. You know, there's this word, repatriation, that is, you know, in the last decade or so, it's something that a lot of institutions are having to grapple with. A lot of historians, you know, a lot of archaeologists have to think about this word. Through my ways and through my investigations, you know, rematriation, as I like to put it, giving back to the earth, giving back to the people, is a concept that transcends the object for me. It also includes the land. It includes the water. It includes the air we breathe. It includes the stewardship of a particular geography. The ideas that saturate the land, the truths that are embedded in these geographies, in these locales. You know, there's a lot of historians in the room tonight. There's a lot of potentially archaeologists, people that work in this setting and have to think about these things, have to think about the unknown, you know, the built environment as clues to a society, to a humanity that existed, you know, in a one-to-one relationship with this planet, with this location. Existed in quotes, because as a matter of fact, we still exist. And that is the ethos of my work. That is the bottom line, the baseline of why I create. As an architect, as an artist, you know, as a technologist, the reason that I, you know, place make, the reason that I create objects, concepts, all function as a vessel for this notion of futurity for Indigenous peoples, this notion of futurity for humanity as a whole. You know, there's a lot of responsibility as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous architect and artist. You know, being here in this present time in 2021, existing on the continent that my ancestors have called home since time immemorial. This is our origin story, this place. These sites, these historical sites, are stars in that constellation that link us back to the origin, back to the earth. Everyone here has an origin story. All of your people have a particular location on this planet that began the story of your ancestry, of your family, of your culture, of your language, of the reason you look the way you look, the reason you eat the foods that you eat. You have an origin story. You're indigenous to this earth, wherever that may be. For me, it's here. For the Pokagon, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, the Anishinaabe, the Miami, the Sauk, you know, the list goes on. It's here. It's here in this state. It's here in this region. It predates state borders, you know, borders of a country, to the point where there's a gradient that's exposed, a gradient of culture, a gradient of relationship to each other and to the land. And as an Indigenous placemaker, that's part of the story that I want to evoke and reawaken and reanimate through my work. You know, I've been a practicing artist for a few years now. Prior to that, my profession was entirely steeped in architecture, in understanding the built environment. But a lot of what was being taught to me was through this Eurocentric, you know, lens. You know, you walk around the city of Chicago, and there's remnants of the Columbus Exposition, of, you know, colonialism, indigenous displacement in our city grid, in the erasure of effigy mounds to create the L lines that, you know, create this public transportation through the city. You see, you know, the Field Museum of Natural History, the Museum of Science and Industry, these relics, these remnants, this residue of displacement, of colonialism, of monumentality to white supremacy through the eyes of the indigenous person. You have the fall of monumentality in Chicago right now. The reevaluation, the accountability of flawed men, of flawed people being brought to the forefront, to the point where every monument to colonialism, to displacement, is being questioned. A list of 400 plus is being reckoned with. I had the honor of serving on the inaugural Monuments and Memorials Committee here in Chicago. And, you know, for me, the list, the growing evolutionary list of monuments to be removed is more numerous than is being presented. And I understand that it's iterative, and it's suggestive, and it's a very first step, almost the first page in a number of chapters in a very long novel. But with this fall of monumentality, you know, for me as an indigenous person sitting in the room, I'm thinking of, what about the monuments that we want saved? What about the monuments that we want rebuilt, that we want preserved, protected? And for me, that's this often overlooked history of the built environment, of the mound. You know, we're here in Illinois. You know, I don't have to say it, you know, you all know of Cahokia. You all know the importance of this place, of this city. You know, at the same time as London in the 1300s at a higher population. The buildings disappeared without a trace, but the foundations remain. This is the epitome of sustainable urbanity. This is something that isn't taught in architecture, American architecture today. This isn't something that is celebrated. You know, beyond the state of Illinois, most people don't know what Cahokia is. And that's a sad truth we all have to reckon with. And that's a sad truth that a sad burden that I have to take, you know, upon myself to reintroduce in every space that I am. The importance of place, the importance of the people that live and breathe and still do. You know, it's a practice for archaeologists, you know, historically to sever this relationship between the living people and the land that they occupied, that were forcibly removed from. You know, the notion of the public land, public park, national park, that's just indigenous land to us that was stolen and is held hostage. That's the same story for a lot of these historical sites. They're being held hostage from us, from our connection to these places, our living, breathing connection. The people didn't just disappear from the face of the continent. If that was true, then I wouldn't be here. You know, my lineage to mound building, the Kosadi people, the Kusa chiefdom, you know, we created a place called Etoa in Georgia, which, you know, white archaeologists call Little Egypt historically. You know, there's that severance, there's that disconnection, this disembodiment, this removal of our story and our narrative to that place. The same goes for Aztlan in Wisconsin, or the Toltec mounds. You know, these superimposed distortions of mound builders, you know, taking on names like Hopewell, you know, non-native names, right, for these civilizations and for these places. These are things that need to be corrected. This is when we think about the shifting historical landscape. These are the things that need to be remedied. You know, the items looted from these sacred sites need to be returned. And this is a practice that is happening, you know, for different institutions that are aware of this necessity. I want to walk you through a few of my works that grapple with this idea of the shifting landscape, the idea that colonialism is a glitch in, you know, the indigenous narrative going back to time immemorial. This few hundred-year glitch in our land and in our relationship to place. This is a piece called Sovereign that I created, in the same silhouette as the traditional Kosadi palmetto hut that my people create. But instead of palmetto grass, instead of, you know, the birch bark used on wigwam, this is Phragmites. This is the non-native invasive grasses that, you know, suffocate the indigenous restoration land here in the city of Chicago. I harvested all this grass along the Indian boundary line here in the city of Chicago, where now there's a mental health hospital. There's a facility that houses kids that are soon to be deported from the country. A similar story to the idea of indigenous removal as the city of Chicago is being constructed, where they pushed people over this boundary line. And if you crossed over historically, they say you were shot on sight. The same site where there's a mass burial, below this indigenous restoration land, where poor people were dumped into a mass grave. I harvested this grass as an act to restore that indigenous restoration landscape, and remove this suffocation. As the first artist at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, I created a piece called Ayotikpa. In my language, it means the fire inside. I took these phragmites and I set them on fire continually throughout the span of the Architecture Biennial. It's a statement piece. I set this hut on top of the representation of an earthen platform mound, and I actually colored, that this earthwork, this conceptual earthwork with actual earth from my ancestral lands. The fire is a looping projection mapped video. I'll give you a sample. That burns and crackles infinitely as this hut burns down, as these non-native grasses are removed. Inside the vessel, this colonial structure, the Chicago Cultural Center, this hut is burning. I wanted to draw attention to the earthen platform mound within the setting, because the Chicago Cultural Center, if people are familiar with it, is actually the exact same footprint, the exact same orientation as Monk's Mound in Cahokia, Illinois. I wanted to draw this parallel between colonial architecture, what is deemed American architecture, and what I deem the original architecture of this land. The foundations of the built environment, the foundations of civilization and urbanity in this country, and what I think should be celebrated in the eyes of architecture. As an artist, a lot of these pieces, can be gestural, right? I see them as warning shots. I see them as seeds being sowed, being watered for the ultimate arrival, the ultimate reanimation of indigenous cities. I see, cities like Cahokia repopulating this continent. I see sustainable urbanity as a solution to this continued relationship with the earth in the face of a looming post-humanity. When we die, there's no sequel. The earth will keep spinning until the sun dies, and so forth and so on. So for our very finite existence on this planet, let's heal instead of scar. Let's think about building places, building cities, that don't leave cavities in the shadow of skyscrapers, cavities in the earth, scars in the earth. Let's think of ways that we can heal. That's what I'm thinking as an architect and as an indigenous person. With that said, as an art and technologist, I often draw upon the inspiration of my ancestors, of our ancestors collectively, of, mound building civilizations on this continent that transcend our tribal affiliations, our, these categories that we're corralled into, these reservations that aren't our ancestral lands today. I try to sift through all of that and decipher through the distortions what our reality, what our prosperity looks like when we don't have to survive anymore, when we can prosper. Behind me, you see an interactive piece called Aticintolocha, in my language, which means the man in the black snake. At the time of creating this work, it's, the Dakota Access Pipeline was going in. I wanted to create a piece that, you can push and pull this sacred living earth inside this box and reanimate, telling the story of our creation through the symbologies of effigy earthworks that are still visible, but also at the same time, telling the story of our destruction. As I push and pull the earth, the symbologies populate the wall behind me. I'm virtually raining this digital water onto the surface. I invite people to put their hands in and push and pull this land, this water, to feel the power of creation in their hands, but to also feel the power of destruction as their humanness taints the earth and turns the water to black oil. Inside the Iotikpa, the fire inside, my installation at the Architecture Biennial, I have this spherical projection of my daughter being 3D scanned and simultaneously painted in this topographical infrared aesthetic. The idea is that as people, we are the land. We come from the land. So I want to draw this parallel in the representation of her being to this very conventional topographical coloring and the drawing of the land and the lines. Indigenous people, just like our sacred objects, are often targeted. These are works that are 3D scans, public domain 3D scans from archaeologists that remove these items from sites in North Carolina. I presented this originally at the Center for Craft in Asheville, North Carolina. Call it Transmissions, where I take these public domain 3D scans and I paint that topography of the land back on top of them. I superimpose, this understanding of our humanity, of our own humanity, just like our own hands, back onto the object. The hands that created this object were born of the land. The materials that created this object come from the land. It's an act, it's a declaration, for us to think about and contemplate where these and who these objects belong to. Instead of being in glass cases with no context inside an institution, inside the constructs of a colonial building. Shouldn't they be in the possession of the indigenous people that created these, the descendants, the direct descendants of the people that created these mundane, sacred, everyday objects, this multiplicity of understanding of existence, culture, truth, embedded in the land below our feet, embedded below the skyscrapers, below the museums, below the streets, below the L lines. It's a hologram that's floating in front of you. The next iteration of this piece will be housed at the Field Museum of Natural History. I am redesigning the entry hall. I'm doing a permanent installation at the Field Museum of Natural History that debuts in the spring of next year. And I'm bringing these holograms to the hall. Only what we're going to create there is we're scanning all the items in the collection that have no context, that essentially are lost, but need to be found. Objects like, you know, what you see in front of you, but they have almost no description. They say thing found in, you know, 1600s by Big Lake. No tribal affiliation, no context, and no understanding of why they should be held hostage inside this institution. The curators I'm working with are compiling a list and scanning objects in their collection, as many as we can, and putting it in this hologram that you can interact with and see everything in that collection that expose this malpractice, that expose this distorted approach to collection. And it brings to question, it brings to mind the idea of rematriation. You know, it's almost like a milk carton with a missing person, calling for the people to claim this, calling for the people to bring this home, to return. The first thing you'll see when you walk into this redesign is this: you are on native land. This huge declaration, this huge reframing of where you are. And the idea is that that corridor that you enter is actually a parcel of native land leased to the indigenous community here in Chicago, the Lying Awake. It's an understanding. It's an acknowledgement and a welcoming of the ancestral peoples, of indigenous peoples, back into the space that is representing them. There's, you know, all these iterations and iterations of the built environment. All these city streets that don't reflect the ancestral understanding of place here on this continent. As an architect, you know, I have the, I hear the call, and I'm heeding the call to create buildings and structures, monuments that celebrate this understanding of what was and what is and what will be. This idea of indigenous futurity brought back into the built environment, where you can walk down a city street and see Cahokia in 2021. We can see Poverty Point, Moundville, you know, all these sites that we as a community invested in the understanding of the history of this land know and celebrate. This is a piece I call New Cahokia. I projection map this, the very first footage of indigenous people doing the buffalo dance is what it's called. Whether or not that's true, they are dancing for Thomas Edison. I wanted to extract this idea of a topography of connection to the land that transcends our own being, that transcends our own finite existence on this earth. You know, in my budding studio practice as an emerging artist, I had these visions of mounds, you know, kind of emerging from the corners of these white walls, of these boxes that we build ourselves into conventionally. You know, the room you're sitting in probably has a corner, right? It's built off these orthographies and conventions that don't necessarily exist in nature naturally. I wanted to break that plane and introduce this ancestral plane, encroaching and emerging into the world that we have created for ourselves through this colonial lens. These mounds taking over to the point where they start to reflect our connection and our relationship to place. And more honestly, you know, through the texture, through the color, start to evoke this understanding of the natural. This piece transformed into an inversion called The Return, which debuted at Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria. I wanted to create a portal of sorts back into self, an understanding of this corner condition and how we can pierce through, how we can reimagine radically what it would be like to burst through these traps that we built for ourselves. The sound that fills the room is the sound of my 1-year-old daughter attempting to read a book in English. But all that comes out is her human babble, her baby speak, as she's unknowingly fighting this forced assimilation, this colonization to read English. All that comes out is her native tongue. Through all those investigations and iterations, the main goal for me as an artist was to reinvigorate this idea that we can build our places again, that this notion of being mound builders in the past and no longer is not a reality. The reality is that it's dormant inside of us. All these civilizations that are studied and housed, all these objects that are collected and sold even, are still connected to us, to our blood memory. They're still flowing through our bodies and through our existence. This is the construction of the very first effigy earthwork since the founding of the United States, notably. Poctochinto, which means serpent twin mound. This debuted on Indigenous Peoples Day of 2019. Here you have the youth, you know, using baskets to push and pull and shape these earthworks. Here's documentation of a ceremony where we had the earth ceremony. I invited you know, all the people in the Indigenous community here to go back to their ancestral lands and collect earth, collect sand, collect cornmeal, collect grains that are sacred, and to imbue them, to store them, to house them inside these earthworks, inside this serpent that weaves in and out of the earth around you, around us, to remind us, to humble us, and to remembering our connection, and to contemplating this relationship with land, water, and sky. It's situated by the Des Plaines River, where we held a ceremony. We started at the river. We walked in a serpentine, single file line, following the grass dancer as he stomped the indigenous grass and prepared the site and reawoke the earth below his feet for the creation of these earthworks. Contemplative placemaking. These effigies have no objects inside of them besides rock, earth, indigenous seeds, grass. They are the life. They are They are the story. The serpent symbology is the story. The serpent symbology is the idea that threads our connection to this planet, that exemplifies this fragility of our existence in perpetuity with this earth. I created a video of travels and research and even documentation of the ceremony for these earthworks. I compiled them into a video for us to see the connection, the relationship of this reanimation and this contemplation of those residual sites and the hope that we have for the future, these new sites. You know, my ethos is for every mound removed, we build 100 more. For every city displaced, every civilization displaced, we repopulate and construct and build. You see Aztlan, you see Moundville, you see Poverty Point. I go out there with my drone and I document all these sites, 3D scan them, try to understand them, pray, listen. There's a blood memory at play. There's a lot missing from the narrative of these sites, right? And the creation of these new sites. But for me, there's an intrinsic understanding through my existence and an intrinsic connection to these places and to these new places that we are constructing. That threshold, that liminal space of survival and prosperity is something that we are encapsulated in. And we're trying to break through. Just like trying to pierce that corner condition of the return and return to the sky, return to this understanding of a world bigger than ourselves. The next earthwork that is being created this year and opening on Indigenous Peoples Day of 2021 is the coiled serpent, Filolo Kachinchinto. This earthwork occupies a site next to the Chicago River inside the city limits of Chicago, where, you know, it's a hybrid typology. It's an effigy earthwork that you can walk on top of to the top, or we can have ceremony where you can go to the top of this earthwork and contemplate your connection. You can see the river below, the city skyline in the distance, with your feet planted on this earth, on this earthwork, on the head of the serpent. The head of the serpent is facing Cahokia. It's facing the Mississippi River. The trajectory of these gestures that we're creating are oriented towards the return of these cities, of these civilizations, of a reawakening, of a reimagination, and an ultimate reconstruction. The ultimatum is evident in a work that I created called Flux Room. This is a recent work that I debuted at the Wonder Museum that paints a landscape, a 360 immersive landscape of a world without us. It's a shifting landscape, a shifting topography of a world without us, created through machine learning, where I fed the algorithm images of indigenous mountain sites, city skylines, forests burning down from fire. And it starts to paint through its own algorithm the destruction and the rebirth of a land without us. It's called flux room. That's the ultimatum. If we don't start to paint and construct worlds and cities that reorient us towards this notion of sustainable urbanity, instead of the skyscraper, instead of the monument to a flawed colonizer like Columbus, we create these spots of contemplation, these earthworks that give us a platform to understand why we exist here, how we exist here, that acknowledge that one-to-one relationship, that perpetuity that goes back and forth, that understanding of indigenous futurism tied to ancestral practice and ancestral understanding and blood memory that is giving us all the clues to create a futuristic world where we can prosper and heal and live in longevity with this planet. It's quite possible that we could live and extend our lifespan here, and we don't have to contemplate the post-Anthropocene so vividly. It isn't so looming. The idea is that we can return. We can return to this understanding. We can hit reset. We can burn down these invasive thoughts of capitalism and unsustainable practices of, placemaking that are destroying this relationship, that are severing our longevity and our prosperity on this planet. My hope, my prayers, my work is that we can better understand places like Cahokia on a more intimate level, on not one that is simply based off of, puzzle pieces that are upside down and buried in the dirt, but that we can actually create and exist within these frameworks again, especially here on indigenous land, with the living, breathing descendants of these indigenous people. And with that said, I'd like to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, X. Yes, questions, comments, audience, you can just type it into your Q&A box or in the chat. We'll try to catch it. While those are coming through, I certainly have a couple of thoughts and questions, and struck by your work with big institutions, right, that are traditionally, not or have a lot of problems with outreach and have been the perpetrators of a lot of the problems that you point to. And, whether it's the Field Museum or the city of Chicago and so on. So I'm curious, there's some people might be critical, like the Field Museum, having an indigenous artist come in and, put something in the lobby and are they just going to say, all right, we've done our part? So what's it been like working with someone like the Field Museum or the city of Chicago, navigating that expectation of what they might have and where you're going and just the institutional things at play there?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's difficult. It's difficult to navigate as an indigenous person these relationships with institutions, right? For me, it's kind of my stance that we're more powerful in our presence than we are in our absence. So if we can be at the table, pointing our fingers. For me, my infiltration, my occupation, if you will, of these particular institutions becomes performative in a way, and not for me. Because if it was performative for me, then I'd be a token, in this system. But it's performative for them. I make, a lot of demands, a lot of upfront kind of calls for understanding that I want them to perform for me as the artist, and that's the ultimate act for me. That is the reward in all of this, is to push the dialogue and discourse forward for the reevaluation of how Indigenous peoples are represented, of how the futurity of these institutions can be more sensitive to our needs and our demands and our living and breathing, relationship with the objects that are put on display. So that's it in a nutshell. Every institution that I'm working with, they know what I'm going to do at this point. When I walk into their walls, I'm going to, create a mirror for them to hold up to themselves, and and a portal of sorts for them to either grow from or hide from. And that's my intention.
I see we have one question. Leah has her hand up, and I've asked her to type in her question. If not, I can also bring her on and have her talk if she's comfortable with that. So we'll see if she can come around that way. But any other questions, you can put it in the chat and we'll figure it out. And I know that we, I mentioned before we came on that William Estrada was our guest yesterday, who is one of your fellow members of the Chicago Monuments Project Advisory Committee. And I certainly get a sense from your talk and your work that just the general idea of having a monument to a person is very limited, kind of regardless of what that person did or didn't do. Do you foresee any way that some of these more traditional sculptures, figurative monuments can be adapted, reused? You see a lot of things where people maybe add something to it or contextualize it or reinterpret it somehow, or is the idea of having a person on a pedestal, time past?
Yeah, I mean, it's look to the sites, look to the idea of monumentality in the effigy. Look to the idea of monumentality, in the different mound formations throughout North America into Central and South America, Minnesota down to Peru. Look at what's celebrated. It's not necessarily a particular person. It's not, it's more inclusive of an understanding, of ecosystems, of existence, of storytelling, collective kind of understanding, because these weren't created by one person to celebrate one person. So I'm looking at kind of the regional conditions and the appropriateness. As an architect, we look at, when we're building a building, you're looking at the urban fabric. There's particular building codes, when you introduce a building into the urban fabric. So you have to look at the precedent. And prior to colonialism, we weren't building monuments to Columbus, or to people per se. So there's a lot of clues on what should and should not be constructed, exalted in the built environment here. And that's my understanding as an Indigenous architect and an Indigenous artist, is I'm looking to what is, what existed before and what should exist in the future. And it looks like, a lot of people are wanting to tear down these monuments to men, to white patriarchy, to colonialism, to slavery. And they want to erect more communal monumentality, like plazas, gathering spaces, spaces for cultural gathering and sharing, and not celebrations of these colonial constructs. So it's refreshing, and the timing is right for the introduction of these earthworks, right?
Great. So we got a couple of questions from the audience here. The first one from Sierra. What's your hope for the new historians and archaeologists who want to be part of the much needed decolonization mindset, especially in these extremely colonial institutions?
My hope is, my ultimate hope is, to take these frameworks that are kind of emerging, these templates, like the Film Museum, is totally redesigning their Native American exhibit hall. Look at that as a precedent. They are, completely engaging with the Native community. They have a Native advisory committee, Native artists like myself, that are brought on board to tell their story more or less unfiltered by the institution. And the institution is supporting us in telling that story. The multiplicity of stories, that kind of saturate our existence and our cultures today, and our understanding of the items within their collection and how to correctly attribute living, breathing stories with those items, whether or not their story ends there within those walls or continues to the rematriation and reclamation by the people. Those are the narratives that I want new historians, new archaeologists, new curators to digest and to absorb, is the fact that when you find an arrowhead, buried in the dirt when you're camping, there's a story, there's a people, there's a person, there's a place that transcends your simple discovery and, your gluing to that shadow box or whatever, where you house it to show off without any context. There's a story. And rather than doing that, what if that was returned to the people, the original peoples, for you to learn that story, for that story to live and breathe within your own capacity as a historian or archaeologist or, excavator. Think about those things and embody it. That all of these things that are being represented, all these places, are living, breathing embodiments of people.
Great. I have time for maybe one more here from Gabby. I really think maybe a good one to end on. Her question is, has the essence of your work changed your perspective on your own identity?
Yeah, the investigations and the trajectory that I'm on as an architect and artist is reawakening. It's reanimating these connections to my ancestors, to place. As I grow, I want to learn more about, every understanding that the living, breathing people have, with these places and with these sites and with these carvings and gorgets and, all these things, right, that have accumulated, that have stories inscribed on them, symbologies, human hands, spiders, serpents, all these things, all these patterns. I'm sifting through it all. And if it wasn't for my trajectory as an artist to create and to build, I wouldn't have found, this calling. I wouldn't have understood the deeper meaning behind what I'm doing if it wasn't for what was missing from the narrative. Looking at these cities and not seeing my own people reflected, looking at the names of streets, looking at the monuments, not seeing our culture celebrated, but rather removed and displaced, seeing the caricature of our leaders, on hockey jerseys, and and corporations exploiting the image of Indigenous people, but not celebrating us in a way that we want to be celebrated through the built environment, through the embracing of our existence, the rematriation of our lands, the acknowledgement of us being the original stewards of these sites. All of this is reawakening in me. It was dormant in my blood, in my ancestors through the portal of survival. And it's reemerging and reawakening in us to the point where we're going to crash the discourse. We are going to go to museums and institutions and infiltrate and re-educate and reanimate until this world welcomes us back, until the land, calls for us to come back and return.
X, thank you so much for your time and a look at your work, and really engaging in our theme, the conference this year, Symposium. And I referenced your website, santiagoxart.com, is that right? Where they can learn more about your work. Certainly next time, hopefully when we all have a chance to get back up to the Field Museum, as your efforts there unfold, we can say that we kind of knew you back when here.
Right.
So thanks for the audience. I'm putting in the chat information for tomorrow's sessions, and then I'm putting in a link to the ISHS YouTube channel, which you can see other sessions, and including this one. We get it uploaded. You can share it with your friends for those of you who missed it. Other than that, thank you again. Thanks, X, and hope to see you all soon at some other ISHS function. And please feel free to reach out to ISHS staff or board members if you want to know more about the society. And of course, please check out X's work online and an exhibit near you if possible. So thanks again, and enjoy your evening.